Welcome to the history of England from 410 AD to just before the Norman invasion of 1066. Episode 6. Living in the 6th and 7th centuries. Basically an overview of life in 6th and 7th centuries in Anglo-Saxon England. Life expectancy was estimated to be in the 20s. Women dying in their teens while giving birth was not uncommon, and there was a prevalence for a man to meet a violent death. Hence the emphasis in the laws about how much recompense should be paid to a person slaying another. The Greek methods of primitive but sometimes effective medical remedies were gone with the Romans, and the Anglo-Saxons being poorer, this led to an increase in the number of children in a family. Economically, this would be offset in the early years by the fact that new farmland was being brought into use, so more children helps economically. Areas like the fenlands fell into disuse, but forests were slowly being cleared, and this was often highly fertile. Frontier lands benefit from large families, in that there is cheap land but requiring hard labour, and so many hands make the work easier. As the children grow, the newly acquired land is further cultivated, leading to surplus food. It is only once there is no further expansion of good quality land that a large family suffers. Some of the Britons, as they were driven out of their land, migrated to what is now Brittany, while also escaping the ravages of the Angles and Saxons. Others may have moved west into Wales, but the old notion that the indigenous population was slaughtered wholesale is no longer thought valid. Although, if captured, the men would either be killed or made slaves. Slaves might also be swapped for other slaves, the reason being that these men would often have been married to the women now being used as wives or concubines of the invaders. Why have the trouble in the form of old husbands when you could simply swap for other new slaves, who you could treat more harshly and not get earache from the women? The heathen Anglo-Saxons did not hold the Christian notion of one husband, one wife. So the idea that even in the first phase of invading they brought their wives with them, they would still have the British women as concubines. It was previously believed that the open field farming system was one of the improvements that the Anglo-Saxons introduced, but the archaeology does not seem to back this up, so any improvements will most likely come from the superior iron ploughshare, the open field system having already been in use with the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons, even with the iron ploughshares, still preferred to farm light soil for arable, the standard 8 oxen being quite capable of ploughing heavy soils, but archaeological evidence suggests oxen are being used in pairs. Unfortunately, Bede tells us nearly nothing on the subject of farming, so techniques are sketchy in the extreme. Some ideas can be gleaned from the archaeology, but the actual reasons for, say, 2 oxen in preference to 8 are not able to be stated as fact, only speculation. The affluence of the country dropped like a stone after the decampment of the Romans. Even before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the amount of wealth was dwindling, and then once the onslaught started, the economy went into steep decline. Although they brought with them the iron ploughshare, it does not seem to have been utilised to its best advantage. Also, as the villas disappeared, large-scale farming went with them. Hence, productivity will have diminished. The newer iron plough may have checked this a little, but without education and written manuals, lots of the added value is just lost. The long-handled scythe, in use by the Romans and in continual use on the near continent, is obvious by its absence. Money was increasingly less available and would not be trusted anyway, so other more tangible items would have been kept for wealth, such as oxen and other animals. Also, the ubiquitous sword, axe heads and jewellery, but these are poor with regards to holding value and difficult to trade. If all one wants is a couple of eggs and a small loaf for your morning breakfast to veggie soldiers and oxen is of no use. Later, in the 7th century, a gold coin of Frankish origin was in circulation, but this was quickly debased until they were nearly completely silver. Basically, what today is known as economic depression would, by the time of the early 6th century, be rife. There would have been deflation shortly after the Romans left, mainly due to the precipitous decline in trade, and then the continuing slow cutting back of wealth as oftentimes the coinage is debased and the amount of commerce reduces. The Longhouse became the centre of the village, and the post holes of 2 of these have been found at Swanton in Hampshire, each measuring approximately 11 metres by 6.3 metres, so 36 foot by 20 foot. They would house some of the farm animals, cattle, goats or pigs, as well as people. Cosy, one thinks. The sheep would be outside in our milder climate in their woolly garments, but goats and cattle with their hair coats were still generally brought under cover in cold weather. With the 2 longhouses at Swanton are found a multitude of smaller structures forming a village community. This would often be surrounded by a wooden barricade which would give some protection against nighttime intruders, not least boar and wolves. The latter would attack livestock and the wild boar would attack anyone. These types of village seem to have been common up to a point, but the most widely found structures from this period are single long houses and 1 or 2 outbuildings, suggesting the hamlet is the most widespread means of living, putting the free man firmly in the basis of Anglo-Saxon life. As the 7th century progressed, the longhouses became longer, and some consolidation may have got underway with isolated farms coming together, although the growth of the family is the more probable reason for the larger long houses at this early stage in development. We are not sure the term Witnagemot was being used this early. It loosely related to the King's Wise Council and was made up of people whom the king chose. However, there may have been quite a bit of local politics involved, so in many cases the king may not have had any say in who attended, this being decided at a local level, perhaps chosen specifically because the king would not like who was sent. It is dangerous during the 6th and 7th centuries to think of kings in the same way as later. In many cases, it was just the local lord who was deemed strong enough to lead the local tribe or tribes. During the 6th century, indeed, it should be noted that much of the fighting was consolidation of lords or princes and local tribes jockeying for position of leader and overlordship, and the term king looks suspiciously elastic. One thing should be made clear. There was little democracy in any of this. It was who was strongest or most daring who won through. A large minority of the Anglo-Saxons were serfs and slaves. As the Saxon period develops, 4 distinct classes emerge: nobles, common freemen, partially freemen, and slaves. It should further be noted that at this early period there is not likely to be any universal agreement as to what the different classes were entitled to. Slaves probably had no entitlement, but this should not be taken as a given. With the steady establishment of the monarchy, personal distinction in the field and closeness to the king will have been reflected in the distinction given to the nobles. Gesith seems to be the earlier term of what is more commonly known as thane, as in distinctly military. Vergold is the worth of a man. Literally, in later centuries, how much a freeman or thane was worth in monetary value. So anyone thinking this was some kind of socialist style of society, forget it. A thane being 6 times the value of a free man, and his oath in court 6 times that of a free man, and it was the thanes who attended the Witnagemot or its precursor. The freeman made up the largest section of Anglo-Saxon society and is known under a number of names: Cheol, sokemen, villanus, which varies in meaning and parts of the country at different times. This was the class by whom the others were reckoned in value. In Kent, at the end of the 6th century, we have the first written laws. They are from Ethelbert, lasting until 616, and lay down mainly compensation claims for losing body parts because of another's action causing death, trespass and having an affair with maidservants. A notable section towards the end of the laws is in relation to how much a wife should get for a divorce. Half if she has children and is going to continue to raise them. Also, the wife automatically gets half of the estate if the husband dies first. No mention is made of the other half, which leaves one to assume, a very dangerous thing to do, that the paternal family gets that half. In fact, if one studies the law in detail, you are left with the feeling that most of the law is unwritten, and certain things seem to be automatically known. That these laws are written down is due to Augustine and his monks who could read and write, and the laws firstly deal with the ecclesiastical worth, before moving on to earls, churls and freemen, who pay recompense to the aggrieved as well as in some cases to the king. As I've already mentioned, the Anglo-Saxons brought with them a potentially more efficient means of farming with the iron ploughshare, and consequently a higher yield for the farmer, the iron being undisturbed by most roots left from the clearance of forest, and able to plough heavier soil, although the archaeological evidence is weighing against this usage. Higher yields mean lower infant mortality rate, which boosts population numbers, as this would happen both sides of the North Sea in the case of those left behind with less mouths to feed, as the raiders were living abroad. It would also give a reason for the continued expansion of the Angles and Saxons. Bede infers that the lands of northern Europe were depopulated by the continued invasions, but this is highly debatable, as there is not the archaeological evidence in those regions that there was a sudden depopulation and mass abandonments. It is quite feasible that many of the early raiders had farms going both sides of the North Sea, the wives and children running them with the aid of slaves during the raiding season, and it was seasonal, while the menfolk went out fighting and plundering. Here's a caveat. What Bede alludes to does in some ways fit that there were less people left at home, so less mouths to feed, and a slight decrease in the numbers is hard to gauge. Even with a record of births and deaths that we have later, these numbers can be debated. Even later written sources make it difficult to measure population increases and decreases. It would also have some effect on the attitudes of these men to women and how they treat them. The traditional rape and pillage has now to be looked at in the light that, after the slaughter of the men, it may be much more of, look, I'll treat you right and not kill you if you'll be my wife, concubine, and look after the farm. To the modern mind, this would be no different to rape, but to the people of the Dark Ages, this is no less than a revolution of attitude. However, this fits into what was to come later, where a patriarchal society gives voice to the female, and, as can be seen after the Normans invade, actually worships her. Having two or more wives separated by a sea is handy for domestic peace. There is a toast given in the Royal Navy, a drink to wives and girlfriends, and may they never meet. It can be imagined the raiders were happy with this situation, and being pagan, it would be seen as manly to have two women on the go at one time. It would be impossible to keep both going perpetually, and for what reason? The children are hardly likely to have two partners either side of the sea, so those left behind would decline in numbers, which again fits. Not mass evacuation, but a diminution of numbers as the children come of age and the visits from England cease. This may also answer why the notion that the waves kept coming and coming for 2 centuries. However, the DNA suggests fairly moderate figures, which would be the case if they kept nipping backwards and forwards. There is, as the 6th century progresses, the weather to be taken into account. In 535 and 536 are seen to have very poor harvests. The dendrochronology supports this. The crap weather can be deduced from a lack of tree ring growth in northern Europe. This would have an effect on expansion. You would only go raiding when you knew that the crops at home were adequate, with some to spare. Otherwise, you would stay at home and directly manage the farm. Indeed, the weather from 535 onwards seems mixed if the tree ring growth is anything to go by. There were a couple of decent years, 538-39, but then it is awful for another 6 or 7 years. This can greatly affect how a community behaves. And, as can be seen, there was a setback in the conquest at 520, with a large defeat for the invaders at Mount Badon under the leadership of Ambrosius Aurelianus, or known more commonly as King Arthur. Then no further gains until the 550s, when the weather improves, and so with it the harvests. This may also just help to add to the myth of Arthur being able to affect the weather. After all, most of the storytelling is still oral, and the problem there is one is reliant on the memory and interpretation from one generation to the next. So Chinese whispers takes hold, and so what one person says helped the invaders, another thinks will sound better if I turned it around and changed the story a bit. It sounds more appealing. So others, retelling the tale, adopt it. Hey presto, history is changed in the telling. At least with the written word, it is mainly the original author who can be accused of being a liar, not the person copying the manuscript, although it has been known. Swords held especial reverence to the Anglo-Saxons, to the extent of being given names. When J.R.R.Tolkien in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings has his characters, especially the elves and dwarves, give names to the swords, it is because the professor of Anglo-Saxon knows this is just what the invaders across the North Sea did. In Beowulf, the eponymous hero is given a sword called Hrunting by Hunferth, the king's jester. A sword's production, until about the 9th century, was by the pattern welding method. This takes 3 strips or 4 strips of iron beaten together like a plaited system, leaving a herringbone or chevron pattern in the metal. It can take between 3 and 4 pounds of iron to produce a pound of sword, the welded metal giving strength, very much like the radial metal bands on the side of a tyre. The sword would then be given a steel edge. Steel making, having slowly made its way from Asia, had been an immediate hit with the invaders. The smith was held in especial high regard, and smithying had its own god, Wieland, who, like Vulcan, the Roman god, was an invalid. It seems that a person standing was recognised by the quality of the sword, and it is the Anglo-Saxons who are buried with their swords, as the shorter in stature Britons are not found with these items. As a side note on smithying, while one tends to think of big strong men being a typical blacksmith, in fact it is much more to do with technique. Yes, wielding a hammer day in day out gives strength in the arms, but it is expertise and practice that makes a good blacksmith. Plus, there are only short distances to walk or move, and most of the time the smith is under cover. You don't want rain teeming down on you while trying to beat out a piece of metal. So an ideal job for someone who has some disability in the legs but is otherwise hale and hearty. Axes were also valued items, both the light hand axe and the iconic double-headed felling axe. And like today, the double-headed axe had a purpose. One edge would be shouldered for the heavy felling of trees. The other is much sharper and delta-shaped for stripping and trimming smaller branches from trees and general lighter work. This is usually the edge that smaller hand axes have. just right for slicing through someone's arm, severing the arteries with a single fell swing, or into their head, cleaving the cranium or through the neck for decapitation, or perhaps cutting some kindling for the fire in quieter moments. They also used a large single-edged knife which was called a seax, and many speculate that the Saxons got their name from this tool. Wool was the main fabric, and along with animal skins makes up the largest proportion of clothing material. Flax had started to be grown and with it linen produced, but these were on very small quantities compared to leather and wool. The wool would be dyed and woven. Woad, Isatis tinctoria, was used for blue. Many plants in Britain give a yellow colour, although weld, Reseda luteola, is the common plant that was used. Lilac and red were also created. Beowulf mentions a crimson cloak. Spinning the wool was done with a distaff made of wood and a drop spindle, this being too early for a spinning wheel. The drop spindle would be of wood or bone with a clay weight. Weaving was done on warp-weighted looms, and also there was a form of knitting using one needle and known as knarl binding. It uses a blanket stitch. Wolf skins were a status symbol, but leather of all types was used, from whole skins for cloaks to strips for belts and added embellishments to outerwear. There is also evidence of silk, but unlike the Romans, this would be really showing off, as it was extremely expensive and appears to have been imported as thread. Although Bede tells us that on his return from a visit to Rome, Benedict Biscop, or Bishop Benedict, sometime around the 690s, sold 2 silk cloaks of incomparable workmanship for 3 hides of land. That is the equivalent of land to support 3 families. To translate this into something akin to today's value, let's keep the figure on the low side and say £40,000 per hide, £120,000 for 2 cloaks at 2020 prices. There were obviously some very rich Saxons having made their pile to be able to afford such luxury. King Aldfrid and his councillors are cited in the story, but we don't know for definite whether the king is named for reasons of protocol or if it was him who bought the cloaks. However, this wealth did not filter down in these large quantities, apart from which, compared to the Romans, this guy does not sound that particularly well off. Jewellery was also worn by men and women. Large buckles, brooches and jewellery on pins with gold inlays and ceramic were used, as well as other metals and stones. Human figures and also animals were depicted, along with abstract design, including very intricate filigree work on the finer objects. This, it is worth noting, compares with the best available to the Romans, which suggests the Anglo-Saxons were capable of the finest that Rome was able to source, but also that they appreciated the artistry required for such work, as it is done without the aid of a magnifying glass. Which leads to the question, was work like this completed in the open for the best possible light, or did they just ruin their eyesight on the principle they may not live past 40 anyway? A plague hit the country in 664. This type of event was frequent and would mould the attitude of the people to life and death. Also, the amount of goods produced and traded is minute in comparison to the Roman period. Nothing is mass-produced. A fashion has grown up in the last 30 years or so not to call the Dark Ages by that name. Indeed, I came to this project with that view, until I started to look up the sources and found they had not been extensively added to. Archaeology had indeed thrown light on many aspects of life in these times. However, archaeology is very much like night vision goggles. It can let one see certain aspects of how life was lived, but the piercing light of the written account that floods an area with so much information that one has to remove the goggles and read the written account is not there with archaeology. Yes, there is so much more known, and we now know what the average Anglo-Saxon had for their meals. how well or poorly fed they were, what they may have worn, how they cooked, how they farmed, who they traded with, and much more. However, they are still the Dark Ages between around 400 AD and 800. There is still little known history. Indeed, until Alfred bursts onto the scene around 870, the archaeology has only filled in certain gaps, and these videos are history, not an archaeological inquiry. Those who build themselves up to say, we now know enough about the period to cease calling it the Dark Ages, are basically full of their own importance and hubris. Give me details about the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, not supposition, who the main players were and the gameplay used, what year it happened, including the political intrigues, and mainly why English became the prominent language, and I shall cease to call it the Dark Ages. In other words, come up with some more history. If you found this video gradely, please thumbs up. I have more coming once a week. Please hit the subscribe button to get the latest episodes and ring that bell-a-roonies to get reminders. I would appreciate any recommendations on other media like Parler, Twitter, Reddit or history forums. I thank you.